It began with a wall that should not have been there. In May of 2025, a team of workers were restoring an abandoned monastery in Bavaria. The monastery had been left in ruins since the war. Its stone halls were cracked, its wooden beams rotted, its stained glass windows shattered into colorless shards. Most of it was set to be converted into a museum. But deep in the cellar, behind layers of brick and plaster, one worker's hammer struck something hollow. At first, they thought it was only an old storage room, but as the dust cleared, a doorway appeared. Behind it lay a sealed chamber, untouched since 1945. The men pried open the door. The hinges screamed with rust. Their flashlights cut through stale air that smelled of earth and time. And in the center of the room, wrapped in faded cloth and standing on a wooden platform, was the statue. The cloth fell away under their hands, revealing a figure that made even the workers fall silent. It was life-sized, carved from oak so dark it looked like stone. The Virgin Mary stood with her hands open, palms facing outward, as though offering comfort. Her cloak, though faded, still carried shades of blue and white. Her eyes were lowered, soft, watching the ground before her. Though she had stood hidden in darkness for 80 years, the statue looked almost new. The wood was uncracked. The paint had not peeled. Dust covered the floor, but none clung to her face. One of the men swore later that when the light hit her eyes, they seemed to glisten, as though damp with tears. Another said the air grew warmer, though the cellar was freezing cold. They pulled back in silence, not daring to touch her again. The discovery made headlines within hours. Reporters swarmed the site. Historians pored over old documents. It did not take long to uncover the truth. The statue had been stolen during the Nazi occupation of France in 1941. It had once stood in a small village church near Lyon. Eyewitness records revealed a chilling pattern. Nazi officers had tried to destroy it. They had dragged it into the street, struck it with hammers, even tried to burn it. But each attempt failed. Tools snapped. Flames would not catch. Frightened, they sealed it in the monastery cellar, hidden away under brick and plaster. For 80 years, it remained forgotten. Now, in 2025, it stood again in the light. The statue was nearly 6 feet tall. Her face was carved with detail so delicate it seemed alive. The artist had given her a slight tilt of the head, as if listening. Her cloak flowed in carved folds, painted faintly in blue, that had survived bombs, fires, and time itself. People said it carried the memory of every prayer ever whispered before it, that children in France had once left flowers at its feet, that widows had lit candles and sworn they felt peace under her gaze. For 80 years, the people of that French village believed it destroyed. Families told stories of how it had saved them from bombings. Survivors whispered that no matter what the Nazis tried, the statue refused to fall. And now it had returned, almost untouched. Within days, crowds gathered at the monastery gates. Locals came with candles and flowers. Journalists came with cameras. Bishops came with prayers and questions. Arguments broke out. Some said it should be moved to a museum in Munich. Others insisted it must return to France. Some believed it should stay in Bavaria, where it had been hidden. Politicians argued about history. Historians argued about ownership. But the people who stood in the grass outside the monastery whispered of something else. They said it was not just wood, not just art. They said it had been saved for a reason. On the third night after its discovery, a worker guarding the chamber fainted. He later told doctors he felt a warm hand press on his shoulder just before he collapsed. The scans showed nothing wrong with his heart, yet he swore it was real. Another guard claimed that when he shone his flashlight across the statue's face, her eyes reflected the beam like living glass. The photo he took showed something stranger still, a faint shimmer, as if tears clung to her cheeks. By the weekend, dozens of visitors swore they smelled roses in the chamber, even though no flowers had been brought inside. The scent was strongest near the statue's hands. Some called it hysteria. Others called it the first miracle of 2025. Among the visitors was Daniel Weiss, a historian from Berlin. He had spent years studying Nazi looting during the war. For him, the statue was a missing piece of history, not a miracle. But when he stood in the chamber, notebook in hand, even he felt uneasy. The air was cool, yet his palms were warm. The wood looked polished, though no one had touched it. And when he left, he wrote a single line at the top of his notes. This is not just history. This is memory. Daniel Weiss sat in the archives of Munich with dust clinging to his sleeves. Stacks of yellowed folders surrounded him, stamped with fading Nazi insignias. He had come to understand how the Virgin Mary statue ended up hidden in that monastery. What he found went deeper than he expected. One folder contained a list marked Sondertransport 41. Among looted chalices, paintings, and gold, there was a single entry. Wooden statue, female figure, confiscated from Saint-Michel-sur-Saône, France. Daniel frowned. Saint-Michel-sur-Saône was a village near Lyon. He had never heard of it, yet the records described not only the theft, but also the soldiers' fear. A report noted, attempts at disposal failed. Recommend storage. Another, written hastily in pencil, read, do not touch at night. Singing. The historian's pen stilled. Singing? He turned the page, and the story unfolded. Saint-Michel was small, no more than a cluster of houses, a vineyard, and a stone church at the village center. In that church stood the statue. It had been carved in the 1600s by an unknown artisan. For centuries, villagers prayed before it. Brides laid flowers at its feet. Children touched its wooden hands before their first day of school. Old men whispered their last prayers under its gaze. When the Nazis invaded France, fear gripped the village. Soldiers marched in, seizing food, wine, and valuables. And then, one day in 1941, they came for the statue. The night before it was taken, the villagers gathered in the church by candlelight. Their priest, Father Moreau, stood before the statue, his face pale but steady. We cannot stop them from taking her, he said softly, but we can give her our word. Men and women knelt, hands clasped, lips trembling. One by one they spoke the same vow. If you save our children, we will keep you here forever. They left offerings of bread, flowers, and handwritten notes at the statue's feet. Mothers pressed rosaries into their children's palms. A few swore they saw the statue's eyes glisten as though with tears. By dawn, the soldiers arrived. Eyewitness testimonies from villagers, preserved in later interviews, painted the same picture. The soldiers dragged the statue into the street, its wooden base scraping against the cobblestones. One struck it with a hammer. The iron head snapped clean off. Another tried to set it on fire. The wood would not catch, though they doused it in petrol. Flames danced, but the cloak and face remained untouched. Panicked, they tried bullets. The shots echoed through the square, splintering walls and breaking windows. But not a single mark scarred the Virgin's face. A German officer shouted orders. The men, pale and sweating, carried the statue away. Records from Nazi files confirm what villagers had always whispered. Attempts to destroy it failed. Soldiers complained of strange dreams. Some heard distant hymns at night. One swore he smelled roses each time he passed the chamber. Finally, the order was given. Hide it. And so they sealed it in the monastery cellar, behind brick and plaster, never to see daylight again. Back in 2025, Daniel traveled to Saint Michel. The village was still small, its vineyard stretching over rolling hills, its stone church rebuilt after the war. He spoke to the elderly, who remembered. Madame Lefebvre, 94, sat with him at her kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she lifted a faded photograph, the last image taken of the statue before the Nazis stole it. "I was a child," she whispered. "They tried to burn her. I remember the fire, but the cloak stayed blue. My father cried. He said we had seen a sign." Another man, Marcel, recalled the vow. "My mother always said the statue saved us. The bombs never fell here. They fell on villages all around us, but not on Saint Michel. She kept her word, so we had to keep ours. But when they took her, we thought our promise was broken." For 80 years, they had believed the statue destroyed. Now, with Daniel's visit, they learned it had survived. Tears rolled down wrinkled cheeks as they heard the news. Back in Bavaria, the strange events continued. Visitors left flowers, only to find them fresh days later, as though untouched by time. Candles burned longer than their wax should allow. Guards swore they felt a presence in the room, not frightening, but steady, like being watched with kindness. Daniel wrote everything down, his skepticism fading. He was a man of history, not faith. Yet the testimonies, the Nazi reports, the survivors' tears, it all pointed to something larger than coincidence. In his notes, he scribbled a question he could not shake. What if the promise was never broken? As debates raged, Germany or France, museum or church, Daniel felt the weight of the past pressing on the present. This was not just wood, not just art. It was a vow carried through generations, a vow that had outlived war, soldiers, and time itself. And in 2025, as people lit candles before it once more, that vow seemed alive again. By autumn of 2025, the statue of the Virgin Mary was no longer just a local discovery. News had spread far beyond Bavaria. Headlines called it the statue that survived the Nazis. Documentaries filmed the monastery chamber. Journalists interviewed survivors in France. Pilgrims traveled from across Europe to glimpse it. But it was not only believers who came. Historians, skeptics, politicians, and tourists stood shoulder to shoulder with the faithful. For the first time in decades, the world seemed to pause. Not for war, not for scandal, but for silence in front of carved oak. The church decided to hold a mass before the statue was moved. The site chosen was Munich Cathedral, large enough to hold thousands, yet even that was not enough. Screens were set up in the square outside. On the morning of the Mass, bells rang from every tower. Crowds filled the streets, carrying flowers, candles, and small rosaries. Some waved French flags. Others carried photographs of parents and grandparents who had lived through the war. Inside, the statue stood near the altar, surrounded by white lilies. Her cloak caught the morning light through stained glass. Though carved 4 centuries ago, she looked alive, hands open, eyes lowered, watching the people gathered before her. Bishops processed in, robes flowing, incense curling. But when the music fell silent, it was not the clergy the people looked at. It was her. From the first prayer, something filled the air. A fragrance, roses, sweet and thick, drifted through the cathedral. People gasped, recognizing the scent. Some clutched their faces, tears already rising. The candles on the altar flickered but did not falter. Their flames stretched tall, steady as if caught in a wind that no one could feel. And then came the sound. Not from the choir, not from the organ. It was soft, faint, like distant singing carried on the air. Harmonies layered, clear and sorrowful, yet full of comfort. No words, only melody. Some said it came from the statue itself. Others swore it came from above, but all agreed it was not of this world. The crowd began to weep. Old men who had fought in the war, children too young to know its story, women holding candles, priests in vestments, even journalists with cameras lowered their lenses, unable to film through their tears. Daniel Weiss, the historian who had once doubted, sat in the pews with his notebook forgotten on his lap. His face was wet, though he could not explain why. He later wrote only one line. I have seen history many times, but today I saw memory made flesh. Even bishops on the altar stood with wet eyes. The Mass was not about them. It was about her. After the Mass, the decision was made. The statue would be returned to Saint-Michel-sur-Saône, the village from which it had been taken in 1941. The journey became a procession. The statue was placed on a truck bed, surrounded by flowers. Crowds lined the roads from Munich to Lyon. In villages along the way, bells tolled as it passed. Some people knelt in silence. Others reached out their hands as though to greet her. When it finally arrived in Saint-Michel, the entire village gathered. Survivors who had been children during the war stood with canes, tears running down their faces. Younger families held babies, whispering prayers as they watched. The statue was carried into the rebuilt church. Candles filled the nave, their flames soft and steady. For the first time in 80 years, she stood where she had always belonged. In the months that followed, the village changed. Pilgrims came from every corner of the world. Some came for faith. Others came for history. Some simply came to stand in silence before her. Not everyone saw miracles, but many said they left with something else: peace. Some claimed to smell roses. Others swore they heard faint music if they stayed long enough. A few said they saw her eyes glisten, as though wet with tears. Historians called it folklore. Believers called it grace. But all agreed the statue had survived what should have destroyed it. Fire, bullets, hatred, and 80 years of silence could not take her away. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped over the vineyards, the statue stood bathed in golden light. Her cloak glowed softly, her eyes lowered, her hands open as though still listening. Candles flickered at her feet. Flowers lined the floor, and the quiet hum of prayer rose from the pews. No cameras clicked. No politicians spoke. Just silence, just breath, just awe. And maybe that was the greatest miracle of all. Not that wood and paint had survived, but that people across the world, for a brief moment in 2025, remembered what it meant to stop, to look, and to listen. Because you don't need to believe in miracles to understand why the world wept.